Hello there. So, we figured out yesterday, well, Opal wanted to go to bed, and we got to learn what else that butt do. She sat down on the controller and, through a little bit of panic and surprise, managed to delete the video that I had recorded yesterday as I was about to hit stop. So, I'm sorry I didn't get to read to you last night. I did read to you, you just didn't hear it. Anyway, so let's try that again with feeling. Chapter 17, in which the moving castle moves house. Howl set to work as hard as if he had just had a week's rest. If Sophie hadn't seen him fight a grueling magic battle an hour ago, she would never have believed it. He and Michael dashed about, calling measurements to one another and chalking strange signs in places where they had earlier put up metal brackets. They seemed to have to chalk every corner, including the backyard. Sophie's cubbyhole under the stairs and the odd-shaped place in the bathroom ceiling gave them quite a bit of trouble. Sophie and the dogman were pushed this way and that, and then pushed aside completely so that Michael could crawl about, chalking a 5-pointed star inside of a circle on the floor. Michael had done this and was brushing dust and chalk off his knees when Howl came racing in with patches of whitewash all over his black clothes. Sophie and the dogman were pushed aside again so that Howl could crawl around, writing signs in and about both star and circle. Sophie and the dogman went to sit on the stairs. The dogman was shivering. This did not seem to be the magic he liked. Howl and Michael raced out to the yard. Howl raced back. "Sophie!" he shouted. "Quickly! What are we going to sell in the shop?" Flowers," Sophie said, thinking of Mrs. Fairfax again. "Perfect," said Howl, and he hurried over to the door with a pot of paint and a small brush. He dipped the brush in the pot and carefully painted the blue blob yellow. He dipped again. This time, the brush came out purple. He painted the green blob with it. And the third dip of paint was orange, and the orange went over the red blob. Howl did not touch the black blob. He turned away at the end of his sleeve went into the paint pot along with the brush. "Botheration," said Howl, dragging it out. The trailing tip of the sleeve was all colors of the rainbow. Howl shook it, and it was black again. "Which suit is that really?" Sophie asked. "I've forgotten. Don't interrupt. It's the difficult part is coming up," Howl said, rushing the paint pot back to the bench. He picked up a small jar of powder. "Michael, where's the silver shovel?" Michael raced in from the yard with a big, gleaming spade. The handle was wood, but the blade did seem to be solid silver. "I'll sit out there," he said. Howl rested the shovel on his knee in order to chalk a sign on both handle and blade. He sprinkled red powder from the jar on it. He put a pinch of the same grains carefully in each point of the star and tipped all the rest into the middle. "Stand clear, Michael," he said. "Everyone stay clear. Are you ready, Calcifer?" Calcifer emerged from between his logs in a long thread of blue flame. "As ready as I can ever be," he said. "You know this could kill me, don't you?" "Well, look on the bright side," said Howl. "It could be me it kills. Hold on tight. 1, 2, 3. He dug the shovel into the grate, and very steadily and slowly, keeping it straight and level with the bars. For a second he juggled it gently to get it under Calcifer. Then, even more steadily and gently, he raised it. Michael was quite obviously holding his breath. "Done it!" said Howl. Logs toppled sideways. They did not seem to be burning. Howl stood up and turned round, carrying Calcifer on the shovel. The room filled with smoke. The dogman whined and shivered. The Howl coughed. He had a little trouble holding the shovel steady. Sophie's eyes were watering, and it was hard to see clearly, but, as far as she could tell, Calcifer, just as he had said to her, did not have feet, nor legs either. He was a long, pointed blue face, rooted in a faintly glowing black lump. The black lump had a dent in the front of it, which suggested at first sight that Calcifer was kneeling on tiny folded legs. But Sophie saw that that was not so when the lump rocked slightly, showing that it was rounded underneath. Calcifer obviously felt terribly unsafe. His orange eyes were round with fear, and he kept shooting out little feeble, arm-shaped flames on either side in a useless attempt to take hold of the sides of the shovel. "Won't be long," Howl choked, trying to be soothing, but he had to shut his mouth hard and stand for a moment to try not to cough. The shovel wobbled, and Calcifer looked terrified. Howl recovered. He took a long, careful step into the chalked circle and then another into the center of the five-pointed star. There, holding the shovel out level, he turned slowly around, one complete turn, and Calcifer turned with him, sky blue and staring with panic. It felt as if the whole room turned with them. The dogman crouched close to Sophie. Michael staggered. Sophie felt as if their place of the world had come loose and was swinging and jigging around in a circle sickeningly. She did not blame Calcifer for looking so frightened. Everything was still swinging and swaying as Howl took the same long, careful steps out of the star and out of the circle. He knelt down by the hearth and, with enormous care, slid Calcifer back into the grate again and packed the logs back round him. Calcifer flopped green flames uppermost. Howl leaned on the shovel and coughed. The room rocked and settled. For a few instants, while the smoke still hung everywhere, Sophie saw to her amazement the well-known outlines of the parlor in the house where she had been born. She knew it even though its floor was bare boards and there were no pictures on the walls. The castle room seemed to wiggle itself into place inside the parlor, pushing it out here and pulling it in there, bringing ceiling down to match its own beamed ceiling until the two melted together and became the castle room again, except perhaps it was now a bit higher and squarer than it had been. Have you done it, Calcifer? I think so, Calcifer said, rising up the chimney. He looked none the worse for his ride on the shovel. You'd better check me, though. Howl helped himself up on the shovel and opened the door with the yellow blob downwards. Outside was the street and market chipping that Sophie had known all her life. People she knew were walking past in the evening, taking a stroll before supper the way a lot of people did in summer. Howl nodded at Calcifer, shut the door, turned the knob orange down, and opened it again. A wide, weedy drive wound away from the door now, among clumps of trees most picturesquely lit, sideways by the low sun. In the distance stood a grand stone gateway with statues on it. Where's this? Said Howl. An empty mansion at the end of the valley, Calcifer said rather defensively. It's a nice house you told me to find. It's the nice house you told me to find. It's quite fine. Well, I'm sure it is, Howl said. I simply hope that the real owners won't object. He shut the door and turned the knob round to purple down. Now for the moving castle, he said as he opened it again. It was nearly dusk out there. A warm wind full of different scents blew in. Sophie saw a bank of dark leaves drift by, loaded with big purple flowers among the leaves. It spun slowly away, and its place was taken by a stand of dim white lilies and a glimpse of sunset on the water beyond. The smell was so heavenly that Sophie was halfway across the room before she was aware. No, your long nose stays out of there until tomorrow, Howl said, and he shut the door with a snap. That part's right on the edge of the waist. Well done, Calcifer. Perfect. A nice house and lots of flowers as ordered. He flung the shovel down and went to bed, and he must have been tired. There were no groans, no shouts, and almost no coughing. Sophie and Michael were tired too. Michael flopped into the chair and sat stroking the dogman, staring. Sophie perched on the stool, feeling strange. They'd moved. It felt the same, but different, quite confusingly. And why was the moving castle now on the edge of the waste? Was it the curse pulling Howl towards the witch? Or had Howl slithered out so hard that he had come out right behind himself and turned out what most people would call honest? Sophie looked at Michael to see what he thought. Michael was asleep, and so was the dogman. Sophie looked at Calcifer instead, sleepily flickering among rosy logs with his orange eyes almost shut. She thought of Calcifer pulsing almost white with white eyes, and then of Calcifer staring anxiously as he wobbled on the shovel. He reminded her of something. The whole shape of him did. Calcifer, she said, were you ever a falling star? Calcifer opened one orange eye at her. Of course, he said. I can talk about it now that you know. The contract allows me to. And Howl caught you, said Sophie. 5 years ago, said Calcifer, out on the Porthaven marshes just after he set out as Jenkin the sorcerer. He chased me in 7-league boots. I was terrified of him. I was terrified anyway, because when you fall, you know you're going to die. I'd have done anything rather than die. When Howl offered to keep me alive the way humans stay alive, I suggested a contract on the spot. Neither of us knew what we were getting into. I was grateful, and Howl only offered because he was sorry for me. Just like Michael, said Sophie.
What's that?
Michael said, waking up.
Sophie, I wish we were right on the edge of the waste. I didn't know we would be. I don't feel safe.
Nobody's safe in a wizard's house, Calcifer said, feelingly. Next morning, the door was set to black blob down, and to Sophie's great annoyance, it would not open at any setting. She wanted to see those flowers, witch or no witch. So she took out her impatience by fetching a bucket of water and scrubbing the chalked signs off the floor. Howl came in while she was doing it. Work, 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 he said, stepping over Sophie as she scrubbed. He looked a little strange. His suit was still dense black, but he had turned his hair fair again. It looked white against the black. Sophie glanced at him and thought of the curse. Howl may have been thinking of it too. He picked up the skull out of the sink and held it in one hand mournfully. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him well, he said. She hurts mermaids, so it follows that there is something rotten in the state of Denmark. I have caught an everlasting cold, but luckily I am terribly dishonest. I cling to that. He coughed pathetically. But his cold was getting better, and it did not sound very convincing. I got the black lung, Pop. Sophie exchanged looks with the dogman, who was sitting watching her, looking as doleful as Howl. You should go back to Letty, she murmured. What's the matter? She said to Howl. Miss Angorian not going well? Oh, dreadfully, said Howl. Lily Angorian has a heart like a boiled stone. He put his skull back in the sink and shouted for Michael. Food! Work! He yelled. After breakfast, they took everything out of the broom cupboard. Then Michael and Howl knocked a hole in the side wall of it. Dust flew out of the cupboard door, and strange thumpings occurred. At last they shouted for Sophie, and Sophie came, meaningly carrying a broom, and there was an archway where the wall had been, leading to the steps that had always connected the shop and the house. Howl beckoned her to come and look at the shop. It was empty and echoing. Its floor was now tiled in black and white squares, like Mrs. Pensman's hall, and the shelves, which had once held hats, had a vase of waxed silk roses and a small posy of velvet cowslips on them. Sophie realized that she was expected to admire it, so she managed to not say anything. I found the flowers in the workshed out back, said Howl. Come and look at the outside. He opened the door into the street, and the same shop bell tinkled that Sophie had heard all of her life. Sophie hobbled out into the empty early morning street. The shop front had newly painted green and yellow. Curly letters over the window said, H. Jenkins, fresh flowers daily. Changed your mind about common names, have you? Said Sophie. Oh, for reasons of disguise only, said Howl. I prefer Pendragon. And where do the fresh flowers come from? Sophie asked. You can't say that and then sell wax roses off of hats. Oh, wait and see, said Howl, leading the way back into the shop. They went through and out into the yard Sophie had known all her life. It was only half the size now because Howl's yard from the moving castle took up one side of it. Sophie looked up beyond the brick walls of Howl's yard to her own old house. It looked rather odd because of the new window in it that belonged to Howl's bedroom, and it made Sophie feel odder still when she realized that Howl's window did not look out onto the things that she saw now. She could see the window of her old bedroom up above the shop. That made her feel odd too, because there did not seem to be any way to get up into it now. As Sophie hobbled after Howl indoors again and up the stairs to the broom cupboard, she realized that she was being very gruff. Seeing her old home this way was giving her fearsome mixed feelings. I think it's all really nice, she said. Really, Howl said coldly. His feelings were hurt. He did so like to be appreciated, Sophie thought, sighing, as Howl went to the castle door and turned the knob purple down. On the other hand, she did not think that she ever praised Howl any more than Calcifer, and she wondered why she should start now.
Oh, hello, sweetness.
Oh, sorry. Let me turn the camera.
Hello, sweetness. This is what you get for sitting on my controller and ruining story time last night.
Here. I will turn the camera down so that we can have the proper star in frame.
I love you, baby girl.
You look like you need a blankie. The door opened. Big bushes loaded with flowers drifted gently past and stopped so that Sophie could climb down among them. Between the bushes, lanes of long, bright green grass led in all directions.
I'm shy.
Lanes of long, bright green grass led in all directions. Howl and Sophie walked down the nearest, and the castle followed them, brushing petals off as it went. The castle, tall and black and misshapen though it was, blowing its peculiar little wisps of smoke from one turret to another, did not look out of place here. Magic had been at work here. Sophie knew it had, and the castle fit somehow. The air was hot and steamy and filled with the scents of flowers, thousands of them. Sophie nearly said the smell reminded her of the bathroom after Howl had been in it, but she bit it back. The place was truly marvelous. Between the bushes and their loads of purple, red, and white flowers, the wet grass was full of smaller flowers, pink ones with only 3 petals, giant pansies with wild phlox, lupins of all colors, orange lilies, tall white lilies, irises, and a myriad of others. There were creepers growing flowers big enough for hats, cornflowers, poppies, and plants with strange shapes and stranger colors of leaves, though it was not much like Sophie's dream of a garden like Mrs. Fairfax. She forgot her gruffness and became delighted. "You see," said Howl. He swung out an arm, and his black sleeve disturbed several hundred blue butterflies feasting on a bush of yellow roses. "We can cut flowers by the armload every morning and sell them in market shipping with the dew still on them." At the end of that green lane, the grass became squashy. Vast orchids sprouted under the bushes. Howl and Sophie came suddenly to a steaming pool crowded with water lilies. The castle veered off sideways around the pool and drifted down another avenue lined with different flowers. "If you come out here alone and bring your stick to test the ground with," Howl said, "it's full of springs and bogs, and don't you go any farther that way." He pointed southeast where the sun was a fierce white disk in the misty air. "That's the waste over there, very hot and very barren and full of witch." "Who made these flowers right on the edge of the waste?" Sophie said. "The wizard Suleiman started it a year ago," Howl said, turning towards the castle. "I think his notion was to make the waste flower and abolish the witch that way. He brought hot springs to the surface and got it growing. He was doing very nicely until the witch caught him." "Mrs. Pensman said some other name," Sophie said. "He came from the same place as you, didn't he?" "All right, you eat your cardboard, you weirdo." "I love you, you very strange dog." "More or less," said Howl. "I mean, I never met him, though. I came and had another go at the place a few months later. It seemed to be a good idea, and that's how I came to meet the witch." She objected to it. "Why?" said Sophie. The castle was waiting for them. "She likes to think of herself as a flower," Howl said, opening the door. "A solitary orchid blooming in the waste. It's pathetic, really." Sophie took another look at the crowded flowers as she followed Howl inside. There were roses, thousands of them. "Won't the witch know you're here?" "Well, I tried to do the things she'd least expect," Howl said. "And are you trying to find Prince Justin?" Sophie asked. But Howl slithered out of answering by racing through the broom cupboard, shouting for Michael. "I love you, you dork." She pulled an empty tissue box out of the recycling, and she's making a freaking saltwater taffy out of it. Chapter 18, in which the Scarecrow and Miss Angorian reappear. They opened the flower shop the next day. As Howl had pointed out, it could not have been simpler. Every early morning, all they had to do was open the door with the knob purple down and go out into the swimming green haze to gather flowers. It soon became a routine. Sophie took her stick and her scissors and stumped about, chatting to her stick, using it to test the squashy ground or to hook down sprays of high-up choice roses. Michael took an invention of his own, which he was very proud of. It was a very large tin tub with water in it, which floated in the air and followed Michael wherever he went among the bushes. The dogman went too. He had a wonderful time rushing around the wet green lanes, chasing butterflies or trying to catch the tiny bright birds that fed on the flowers. While he dashed about, Sophie cut armloads of long irises or lilies or frondy orange flowers or branches of blue hibiscus, and Michael loaded the bath with orchids, roses, starry white flowers, shiny vermilion ones, or anything that caught his fancy. They all enjoyed this time. Then, before the heat in the bushes grew too intense, they took the day's flowers back to the shop and arranged them in a motley collection of jugs and buckets, which Howl had dug out of the yard. 2 of the buckets were actually the 7-league boots. Nothing, Sophie thought, as she arranged shocks of gladiolus in them, could show how completely Howl had lost interest in Letty. He did not care now if Sophie used them or not. Sophie was nearly always missing Howl was nearly always missing while they gathered flowers, and the doorknob was always turned black down. He was usually back for a late breakfast, looking dreamy, still in his black clothes. He would never tell Sophie which suit the black one really was. "I'm in mourning for Mrs. Pensman," was all that he would say, and if Sophie or Michael asked why Howl was always away at that time, Howl would look up injured and say, "If you want to catch a schoolteacher, you have to catch her before school starts." Then he would disappear into the bathroom for the next 2 hours. Meanwhile, Sophie and Michael put on their fine clothes and opened the shop. Howl insisted upon the fine clothes. He said that it would attract custom. Sophie insisted that they all wore aprons, and after the first few days, when the people of Market Chipping simply stared through the window and did not come into the shop became very popular. Word had gone round that Jenkins had flowers like no flowers ever seen before. People Sophie had known all her life came through and bought flowers by the bundle. None of them recognized her, and that made her feel very odd. They all thought that she was Howl's old mother, but Sophie had had enough of being Howl's old mother. "I'm his aunt," she told Mrs. Cesare. She became known as Aunt Jenkins. By the time Howl arrived in the shop in a black apron to match his suit, he usually found it quite busy. He made it busier still. This was when Sophie began to be sure that the black suit really was the charmed gray and scarlet one. Any lady Howl served was sure to go away with at least twice as many flowers as she asked for. Most of the time, Howl charmed them into buying 10 times as much, and before long, Sophie noticed ladies peering in and deciding not to come into the shop when they saw Howl there. She did not blame them. If you just wanted a rose for your buttonhole, you do not want to be forced by 3 dozen orchids. She did not discourage Howl when Howl took to spending long hours in the workshed across the yard. "I'm setting up defenses against the witch before you ask," he said. "By the time I'm finished, there will be no way that she can get into any part of this place." There was sometimes a problem with leftover flowers. Sophie could not bear to see them wilting overnight. She found she could keep them fairly fresh if she talked to them. After that, she talked to the flowers a lot. She got Michael to make her a plant nutrition spell, and she experimented in buckets in the sink and in tubs in the alcove where she used to trim hats. She found that she could keep some plants fresh for days. So, of course, she experimented some more. She got the soot out of the yard and planted things in it, muttering busily. She grew a navy blue rose like that, which pleased her greatly. Its buds were coal black, and its flowers opened bluer and bluer until they became almost the same blue as calcifer. Sophie was so delighted with this that she took roots from all the bags hanging on the beams and experimented with those. She told herself that she had never been happier in her life. But this was not true. Something was wrong, and Sophie could not understand what. Sometimes she thought it was the way that no one in Market Chipping recognized her. She did not dare go and see Martha for fear that Martha would not know her either. She did not dare tip the flowers out of their 7-league boots and go off to see Letty for the same reason. She just could not bear to see either of her sisters. She just could not bear for either of her sisters to see her as an old woman. Michael went off with bunches of spare flowers to see Martha all the time. Sometimes Sophie thought that was what was the matter with her. Michael was so cheerful, and she was left on her own in the shop more and more often. But that did not seem to be quite it. Sophie enjoyed selling flowers on her own. Sometimes the trouble seemed to be Calcifer. Calcifer was bored. He had nothing to do except keep the castle gently drifting along the lanes of grass and round the various pools and lakes, and to make sure that they arrived in a new spot with new flowers every morning. His blue face was always leaning eagerly out of the grate when Sophie and Michael came in with their flowers. "I want to see what it's like out there," he said. Sophie brought him tasty-smelling leaves to burn, which made the castle room smell as strongly as the bathroom, but Calcifer said that what he really wanted was company. They went into the shop all day and left him alone. So Sophie made Michael serve in the shop for at least an hour every morning, while she went and talked to Calcifer. She invented guessing games to keep Calcifer occupied when she was busy, but Calcifer was still discontented. "When are you going to break that contract with Howl?" he asked more and more often, and Sophie put Calcifer off. "I'm working on it," she said. "It won't be long now." This was not quite true. Sophie had stopped thinking of it unless she had to, when she had put together that Mrs. Pensman when she had put together what Mrs. Pensman had said with all of the things that Howl and Calcifer had said, she found that she had some strong and rather terrible ideas about that contract. She was sure that breaking it would be the end of both Howl and Calcifer. Howl might deserve it, but Calcifer did not. And since Howl seemed to be working quite hard in order to slither out of the rest of the witch's curse, Sophie wanted to do nothing unless she could help. Sometimes Sophie thought that it was simply that the dogman was getting her down. He was such a doleful creature. The only time he seemed to enjoy himself was when he chased out down the green lanes between the bushes every morning. For the rest of the day he trudged gloomily about after Sophie, sighing deeply. And anybody who owns a dog knows just what that sounds like. As Sophie could do nothing about him either, she was rather glad when the weather grew hotter and hotter towards Midsummer Day, and the dogman took to lying in patches of shade out in the yard, panting. Meanwhile, the roots that Sophie had planted had become quite interesting. The onion had become a small palm tree, and was sprouting little onion-scented nuts. Another root grew into some sort of pink sunflower. Only one was slow to grow. When at last it put out 2 round green leaves, Sophie could hardly wait to see what it would grow into. The next day it looked as if it might be an orchid. It had pointed leaves spotted with mauve, and a long stalk growing out of the middle with a huge bud in it. The day after that, Sophie left the fresh flowers in the tin bath, and hurried eagerly to the alcove to see how it was getting on. The bud had opened into a pink flower like an orchid that had been through a mangle. It was flat and joined to the stalk just below a round tip. There were 4 petals sprouting from a plump pink middle, 2 pointing downwards, and 2 more halfway up, that stuck out sideways. While Sophie stared at it, a strong scent of spring flowers warned her that Howl had come in and was standing behind her. "What's that thing?" he said. "If you were expecting an ultraviolet violet or an infrared geranium, you got it wrong, Mrs. Mad Scientist." "Looks to me like a squashed baby flower," Michael said, coming to look. It did, too. Howl shot Michael an alarmed look and picked up the flower in its pot. He slid it out of the pot in his hand, where he carefully separated the white, thready roots and the soot and the remains of the manure spell until he uncovered the brown forked root that Sophie had grown it from. "I might have guessed," he said. "It's mandrake root. Sophie strikes again. You do have a touch, don't you, Sophie?" He put the plant carefully back, passed it to Sophie, and went away, looking rather pale. Oof. I can feel my blood sugar tanking, which means I get emergency chocolate. Story time requires a lot of energy. So that was almost all of the curse coming true. Sophie thought as she went to arrange the fresh flowers into the shop window. The mandrake root had been a baby. That only left one thing, the wind to advance an honest mind. If that meant Howl's mind had to be honest, Sophie thought, there was a chance that the curse might never come true. She told herself it served Howl right anyway for going courting Miss Angorian every morning in a charmed suit, but she still felt alarmed and guilty. She arranged a sheaf of white lilies in a 7-league boot. She crawled out into the window to get them just so, and she heard a regular clump, clump, clump from outside in the street. It was not the sound of a horse, it was the sound of a stick hitting the stones. Sophie's heart was behaving oddly even before she dared look out the window. There, sure enough, came the Scarecrow, hopping slowly and purposefully down the center of the street. The rags trailing from its outstretched arms were fewer and grayer, and the turnip of his face was withered into a look of determination, as if it had hopped ever since Howl had hurled it away, until at last it had hopped its way back. Sophie was not the only one to be scared. The few people about that early were running away from the Scarecrow as hard as they could run, but the Scarecrow took no notice of them and hopped on. Sophie hid her face from it. "We're not here," she told it in a fierce whisper. "You don't know we're here. You can't find us. Hop away fast." The clump, clump, clump of the hopping stick slowed as the Scarecrow neared the shop. Sophie wanted to scream for Howl, but all she seemed to be able to do was go on repeating, "We're not here. Go away quickly." And the hopping sped up, just as she told it to, and the Scarecrow hopped its way past the shop and on through Market Chipping. Sophie thought she was going to come over queer, but she seemed to just have been holding her breath. She took a deep breath and felt shaky with relief. If the Scarecrow came back, she could send it away again. Howl had gone out when Sophie went into the castle room. "He seemed awfully upset," Michael said. Sophie looked at the door. The knob was blacked on. Not that upset, she thought. Michael went out too, to Cesari's that morning, and Sophie was alone in the shop. It was very hot. The flowers wilted in spite of the spells, and very few people seemed to want to buy any. What with this, and the mandrake root, and the Scarecrow, all of Sophie's feelings seemed to come to a head, and she was downright miserable. "It may be the curse hovering to catch up with Howl," she sighed to the flowers, "but I think it's being eldest, really. Look at me. I set out to seek my fortune, and I end up exactly where I started, and old as the hills still." Here the dog-man put his glossy red snoot round the door of the yard and whined, and Sophie sighed. Never an hour passed without the creature checking up on her. "Yes, I'm still here," she said. "Where do you expect me to be?" The dog came inside the shop. He sat up and stretched his paws out stiffly in front of him. Sophie realized that he was trying to turn into a man. The poor creature. She tried to be nice to him because he was, after all, worse off than she was. "Oh, big stretch. Try harder," she said. "Put your back into it. You can be a man if you want." The dog stretched and straightened his back and strained, and just as Sophie was sure he was going to have to give up or topple over backwards, he managed to rise on his hind legs and heave himself up into a distraught ginger-haired man. "I envy Howl," he panted. "Does that so easily. I was dog in the hedge you helped. Told Letty I knew you. I'd keep watch. I was here before and he began to double back up again into a dog and howled with annoyance. "With witch and shop!" he wailed, and fell forward onto his hands, growing a great deal of gray and white hair as he did so. Sophie stared at the large, shaggy dog that now stood there. "You were with the witch," she said. She remembered now. The anxious, ginger-haired man who had stared at her in horror. "Then you know who I am, and you know I'm under a spell. Does Letty know too?" The huge, shaggy head nodded. "And she called you Gaston," Sophie remembered. "Oh, my friend, she has made it hard for you. Fancy having all that hair in this weather. You'd better go find somewhere cool." The dog nodded again and shambled miserably into the yard without any bacon or love or snuggles or belly rubs. "Why did Letty send you?" Sophie wondered. She felt thoroughly put out and disturbed by this discovery. She went up the stairs and through the broom cupboard to talk to Calcifer. Calcifer was not much help. "Doesn't make any difference how many people know you're under a spell," he said. "It hasn't helped the dog that much, has it?" "No, but," Sophie said, but just then the castle door clicked and opened. Sophie and Calcifer looked. They saw the doorknob was still set to black down, and they expected Howl to come through it. It was hard to say which of them was more astonished when the person who slid rather cautiously round the door turned out to be Miss Angorian. Miss Angorian was equally astonished. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought Mr. Jenkins might be here." "He's out," Sophie said stiffly, and she wondered where Howl had gone, if not to see Miss Angorian. Miss Angorian let go of the door, which she had been clutching in her surprise. She left it swinging open on nothing, and came pleadingly towards Sophie. Sophie found that she had got up herself and come round across the room. It seemed as if she was trying to block Miss Angorian off. "Please," said Miss Angorian, "don't tell Mr. Jenkins I was here. To tell you the truth, I only encouraged him in the hope of getting news of my fiancé, Ben Sullivan, you know. I'm positive Ben disappeared to the same place Mr. Jenkins keeps disappearing to. Only Ben didn't come back." "There's no Mr. Sullivan here," Sophie said, and she thought, "That's Wizard Suleiman's name. I don't believe a word of it." "Oh, I know that," Miss Angorian said, "but this feels like the right place. Do you mind if I just look round to give myself some idea of the sort of life Ben's leading now?" She hooked her sheet of black hair behind one ear and tried to walk further into the room. Sophie stood in the way. This forced Miss Angorian to tiptoe pleadingly away sideways towards the workbench. "How very quaint," she said, looking at the bottles of jars. "What a quaint little town," she said, looking out of the window. "It's called Market Chipping," Sophie said, and she moved round and herded Miss Angorian backwards towards the door. "And what's up those stairs?" said Miss Angorian, pointing towards the open door on the stairs. "Howl's private room," Sophie said firmly, walking Miss Angorian away backwards. "And what's through that other open door?" Miss Angorian asked. "A flower shop," said Sophie. "Nosy Parker," she thought. By this time, Miss Angorian either had to back into the chair or out through the door again. She stared at Calcifer in a vague, frowning way, as if she was not sure what she was seeing, and Calcifer simply stared back without saying a word. This made Sophie feel better about not being so very friendly. Only people who understood Calcifer were really welcome in Howl's house. But now Miss Angorian made a dive round the chair and noticed Howl's guitar leaning up in its corner. She snatched it up with a gasp and turned round, holding it to her chest possessively. "Where did you get this?" she demanded in a low, emotional voice. "Ben had a guitar like this. It could be Ben's." "I heard Howl bought it last winter," Sophie said, and she walked round forward again, trying to scoop Miss Angorian out of her corner and through the door. "Something's happened to Ben," Miss Angorian said throbbingly. "He would never have been parted from his guitar. Where is he? I know he can't be dead. I'd know it in my heart if he were." Sophie wondered whether to tell Miss Angorian that the witch had caught the wizard Suleiman. She looked across to see where the human skull was. She had half a mind to wave it in Miss Angorian's face and say it was the wizard Suleiman's. But the skull was in the sink, behind the hidden bucket of spare ferns and lilies, and she knew that if she went over there, Miss Angorian would ooze out into the room again. Besides, it would be unkind. "May I take the guitar?" Miss Angorian said, huskily, clutching it to her. "To remind me of Ben." The throb in Miss Angorian's voice annoyed Sophie. "No," she said. "There's no need to be so intense about it. You know proof that it is his." She hobbled close to Miss Angorian and seized the guitar by its neck. Miss Angorian stared at her over it with wide, anguished eyes, and Sophie dragged Miss Angorian hung on. The guitar gave out horrible, out-of-tune jangles. Sophie jerked it out of Miss Angorian's arms. "Don't be silly," she said. "You've no right to walk into other people's castles and take their guitars. I've told you Mr. Sullivan is not here. Now go back to Wheels. Go on," she said, and she used the guitar to push Miss Angorian backwards out through the open door. Miss Angorian backed into the nothingness until half of her vanished. "You're hard," she said reproachfully. "Yes, I am," said Sophie, and she slammed the door on her. She turned the knob to orange down to prevent Miss Angorian coming back and dumped the guitar back in its corner with a firm twang. "And don't you dare tell Howl she was here," she said unreasonably to Calcifer. "I bet she came to see Howl. The rest was just a pack of lies. Wizard Suleiman was settled here years ago. He probably came to get away from her beastly throbbing voice." Calcifer chuckled. "I've never seen anyone got rid of so fast," he said. This made Sophie feel both unkind and guilty. After all, she herself had walked into the castle in much the same way, and she had been twice as nosy as Miss Angorian. "Gah!" she said. She stumped into the bathroom and stared into her withered old face in the mirror. She picked up one of the packets labeled skin and tossed it down again. Even young and fresh, she did not think her face compared particularly well with Miss Angorian's. She hobbled rapidly back and seized ferns and lilies from the sink. She hobbled them, dripping to the shop, where she rammed them into a bucket of nutrition spell. "Be daffodils," she told them in a mad, angry, croaking voice. "Be daffodils and Jude, you beastly things!" The dogman put his shaggy face round the yard door. When he saw the mood that Sophie was in, he backed out again hurriedly. When Michael came merrily in with a large pie a minute later, Sophie gave him such a glare that Michael instantly remembered a spell that Howl had asked him to make up and fled away through the broom cupboard. She snarled after him. She bent over her bucket again. "Be daffodils, be daffodils," she croaked. It did not make her feel any better that she knew it was a silly way to behave. So, now that everybody has gotten a bonus view of the lovely Opal, who is sweet and stinky and full of love, and she, in turn, might be sound asleep, and also has not sat on the controller to curse me with losing my 2 chapters again. She not know what that but do. I think that you have much more important things to deal with right now, dear. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a single thing about you, then I can love you. So, good night, dear. Sleep well. And I love you.